There's a reason your boss read this book but never told you about it. There's a reason it was banned by the church and condemned by moralists for 5 centuries. There's a reason the word Machiavellian is whispered like a curse, while the people using his strategies run companies, win elections, and control rooms without saying a word. Niccolò Machiavelli wrote the rulebook for power in 1513, and nothing, not democracy, not the internet, not your HR department has changed the game he described. The only thing that's changed is who knows they're playing. And right now, someone in your life is using these exact principles against you while you convince yourself that hard work and good intentions are enough. They're not. And by the end of this, you'll understand why the people who pretend to hate Machiavelli are usually the ones following him most carefully. Asterisk. There's a book that was written over 500 years ago. A book so dangerous, so brutally honest about the nature of power, that the Catholic Church banned it, that its author's name became synonymous with evil, that even today people use the word Machiavellian as an insult, as if acknowledging certain truths about human nature makes you a monster. But here's what they don't tell you. Niccolò Machiavelli wasn't teaching people how to be evil. He was teaching them how to see the world as it actually is, not as we wish it to be. He was pulling back the curtain on the game that's being played all around you, every single day, in your workplace, in your relationships, in every social interaction you have. And the people who pretend to be scandalized by his ideas, the ones who clutch their pearls and insist that power doesn't work the way Machiavelli described, those are often the very people who are using his principles against you, while you remain blind to what's happening. Machiavelli wrote The Prince in 1513, and in the centuries since, countless leaders have read it in secret, have applied its lessons while publicly denouncing its methods, have built empires and toppled kingdoms using the psychology he outlined. And the reason his ideas still work today, the reason they're just as relevant in a modern office building as they were in a Renaissance palace, is because he wasn't writing about politics. He was writing about human nature. And human nature doesn't change. The same psychological patterns that drove people in the 16th century are driving people right now. The same vulnerabilities, the same fears, the same desires for status and security. Machiavelli understood these patterns with a clarity that most people will never achieve because most people are too invested in believing comfortable lies about how the world works. So let me take you through 7 of Machiavelli's most powerful psychological principles. The ones that make people uncomfortable precisely because they're true. The ones that are being used around you right now, whether you recognize them or not. And I'm not telling you this to turn you into some ruthless manipulator. I'm telling you this because if you don't understand how power actually works, if you keep operating under naive assumptions about fairness and merit and good intentions, you will be outmaneuvered by people who do understand these principles. You'll wonder why you keep getting passed over, why your good work doesn't get recognized, and we people with worse ideas and less talent somehow end up ahead of you. And the answer will be staring you in the face the whole time. They're playing a game you don't even know you're in. Lesson 1. It is better to be feared than loved. If you cannot be both, this is probably Machiavelli's most famous statement. And it's probably the most misunderstood. People hear this, and they think Machiavelli is advocating for cruelty, for ruling through terror, for being a tyrant who makes everyone miserable. But that's not what he's saying at all. What Machiavelli understood, what he observed through years of studying political power, is that love is unreliable. Love is conditional. Love can turn to hate the moment you fail to meet someone's expectations, the moment you have to make a decision that disappoints them, the moment their interests no longer align with yours. People will love you when you're giving them what they want, when you're meeting their needs, when you're making them feel good. But the second you stop being useful to them, the second maintaining that relationship requires sacrifice on their part, that love evaporates. Fear, on the other hand, is stable. Not terror, not paranoia, but respect backed by consequences. When people fear you, in the sense that they understand there will be real repercussions for crossing you, for failing to meet their commitments, for betraying your trust, that creates a reliable foundation. They don't need to like you. They don't need to be emotionally invested in your success. They just need to understand that their own interests are best served by maintaining the relationship, by honoring their agreements, by not testing your boundaries. And here's the crucial part that people miss. Machiavelli isn't saying you should go around terrorizing people or being needlessly cruel. In fact, he warns explicitly against cruelty that serves no purpose. What he's saying is that when you have to choose, when you can't have both love and fear, fear is the more reliable foundation for maintaining power. Think about your own life, about the people who have authority over you, the ones you genuinely respect, the ones whose authority you never question. Aren't they the ones who have clear boundaries, who follow through on consequences, who you know won't tolerate certain behaviors? You might not love them, you might not hang out with them socially, but you respect their position because you understand that testing them would be costly. Now compare that to the people who try to be everyone's friend, who want to be loved and liked above all else, who avoid conflict and difficult decisions because they're terrified of disappointing anyone. Those people get walked over. Their authority gets tested constantly. People push boundaries because they know there won't be real consequences. And eventually, those leaders lose their position because they can't maintain order. They can't make hard decisions. They can't protect their own interests because they're too busy trying to make everyone happy. Machiavelli observed this pattern over and over in Renaissance Italy. Leaders who tried to rule through generosity and kindness alone found themselves betrayed the moment circumstances changed. But leaders who established clear consequences, who demonstrated that crossing them was costly, who created fear in the sense of respect backed by power, those leaders maintained their positions even when they couldn't give people what they wanted. And this doesn't just apply to formal leadership positions. This applies to every relationship where there's any power dynamic at all. If you are someone who will tolerate anything to be liked, who will sacrifice your own boundaries and interests to maintain peace, who signals that there are no consequences for treating you poorly, you will be treated poorly. Not because people are inherently evil, but because humans are practical creatures who will take the path of least resistance. If they can get what they want from you without respecting your boundaries, without considering your interests, they will. That's not cruelty, that's just efficiency. Lesson 2. Never show your full capabilities. Let people underestimate you. This is one of Machiavelli's subtler insights, but it's devastatingly effective. There's a natural human tendency to want to prove yourself, to demonstrate your capabilities, to make sure everyone knows how talented and competent you are. We think that displaying our full range of skills and knowledge will earn us respect and opportunities. But Machiavelli understood something most people never figure out. Being underestimated is a strategic advantage. When people underestimate you, they make mistakes around you. They speak freely about things they should keep hidden. They don't see you as a threat, so they don't guard themselves against you. They dismiss your moves as luck or accident rather than strategy. And by the time they realize what's happening, by the time they understand that you're far more capable than they assumed, you're already in a position they can't challenge. This principle works because of a fundamental aspect of human psychology. We're constantly assessing threats and opportunities in our environment, and we make most of these assessments based on first impressions and surface-level observations. When someone appears less capable, less intelligent, less strategic than they actually are, we categorize them as non-threatening. We stop paying careful attention to their actions. We stop analyzing their motives. We assume we understand them and can predict them, and we move on to monitoring the people we perceive as actual competition. This creates a massive blind spot. While everyone is focused on the obvious players, the ones who are constantly displaying their capabilities and jockeying for position, the person who has been underestimated is maneuvering freely, building relationships, gathering information, positioning themselves strategically, all without attracting the scrutiny and interference that comes with being perceived as a threat. Machiavelli saw this strategy employed successfully by some of the most effective political operators of his time. They would deliberately play up their weaknesses, downplay their strengths, and allow others to believe they were simpler or less capable than they actually were. And while their rivals fought obvious battles against obvious opponents, these underestimated players would be executing long-term strategies that no one saw coming until it was too late. You see this pattern in modern contexts constantly. The colleague who seems passive in meetings, but has been quietly building relationships with key decision-makers. The person who appears to struggle with technical details, but actually understands the political landscape better than anyone else in the room. The leader who plays the fool while carefully observing everything and everyone, gathering intelligence that others don't even know they're revealing. The key to this strategy is patience and discipline. You have to resist the ego's constant demand for recognition. You have to let other people take credit. Let them believe they're smarter than you. Let them feel comfortable and superior in your presence. And this feels terrible to the ego because we're wired to seek status and recognition. But strategic advantage is worth more than immediate validation. When you reveal your full capabilities too early, you force people to respond to you as a threat. They start guarding their information, blocking your access, and actively working against you. But when they underestimate you, they give you access they would never grant to someone they perceived as competition. They include you in conversations you shouldn't hear. They ignore warning signs they would normally notice. They make the fatal mistake of thinking they have time to deal with you later after they've handled the more obvious threats. And by the time later arrives, you're no longer in a position they can easily deal with. Lesson 3. Keep your intentions ambiguous. Never let others predict your next move. Predictability is a weakness. When people can predict what you're going to do, when they can anticipate your responses and reactions, and when they understand your patterns and decision-making process, they can manipulate you. They can set up situations that force you into choices that serve their interests rather than yours. They can prepare countermeasures to whatever strategy you're pursuing. They can stay 2 steps ahead of you because they're not reacting to what you're actually doing. They're reacting to what they know you're about to do. Machiavelli understood that maintaining power requires keeping others off balance, ensuring they can never quite figure out what you're thinking, what you're planning, what you're going to do next. Ambiguity creates anxiety, and anxiety makes people cautious, defensive, reactive rather than proactive. This doesn't mean being random or chaotic. In fact, random unpredictability is just another kind of pattern that people can identify and plan around. What Machiavelli advocated for was strategic ambiguity, where you maintain multiple plausible interpretations of your intentions, where your actions could be explained by several different motives, where people are never quite sure whether you're being genuine or strategic. cooperative or competitive, satisfied or preparing for something bigger. This forces everyone around you to hedge their bets, to avoid committing fully to any particular strategy for dealing with you, because they can't be sure which version of you they're actually dealing with. And while they're trapped in this state of uncertainty, unable to commit to a clear strategy, you maintain maximum flexibility to respond to changing circumstances in whatever way serves your interests best. Think about the people in your life who hold real power, not the ones with impressive titles, but the ones who actually shape outcomes and control situations. Notice how often you're not quite sure what they're thinking, what they really want, whether they're pleased or displeased with how things are going. This isn't an accident. This isn't social awkwardness or poor communication. This is strategic ambiguity. They're maintaining a position where others have to constantly guess, constantly seek their approval, and constantly adjust their behavior based on incomplete information. And this keeps them in the center of attention and influence, because everyone is focused on interpreting their signals, trying to figure out what they want, what they're planning, how to position themselves relative to this person whose intentions remain unclear. Machiavelli observed that rulers who telegraphed their intentions too clearly, who were transparent about their plans and motivations, found themselves constantly outmaneuvered by rivals who could prepare countermeasures well in advance. But rulers who kept their cards close, who maintained multiple possible interpretations of their actions, who revealed their intentions only after it was too late for opponents to effectively respond, those rulers survived and thrived. And you see the same dynamic playing out in every competitive environment. The negotiator who reveals their bottom line gets exactly that and nothing more. The employee who telegraphs their job search gets frozen out of opportunities. The leader who announces their strategy gives competitors time to counteract it. But the person who keeps everyone guessing, who maintains ambiguity about their intentions and capabilities, that person retains the initiative and keeps everyone else in a reactive position. Lesson 4. Master the art of appearing virtuous while doing what's necessary. Here's where Machiavelli really makes people uncomfortable, because he's essentially saying that appearance matters more than reality when it comes to maintaining power. He's not saying you should be cruel or immoral, though he's clear that sometimes maintaining power requires actions that violate conventional morality. What he's saying is that if you're going to take actions that others might judge harshly, you need to control the narrative around those actions. You need to appear to be acting from noble motives, even when you're actually acting from strategic necessity. Because people don't respond to what you actually do or why you actually do it. They respond to their interpretation of what you do, to the story they tell themselves about your motives and character. This is deeply cynical, and it runs counter to everything we're taught about authenticity and integrity. We're told to be ourselves, to act from our values, to let our actions speak for themselves. But Machiavelli spent years watching political operators succeed or fail. And what he observed was that the leaders who survived weren't necessarily the most moral or the most authentic. They were the ones who understood that perception shapes reality in the realm of power. A leader could make harsh but necessary decisions, could act ruthlessly when circumstances demanded it, and maintain their position as long as they could frame those actions in terms that the public found acceptable. But a leader who made the same decisions without controlling the narrative around them, without appearing to act from necessity rather than cruelty, from principle rather than self-interest, that leader would be condemned and eventually removed. The key insight here is that morality in the realm of power is largely performative. This doesn't mean morality doesn't exist or doesn't matter in some absolute sense. It means that in terms of maintaining power and influence, what matters is not whether your actions are actually moral by some objective standard, but whether they can be perceived as moral by the people whose support you need. Machiavelli watched leaders lose everything. They were honest about their motives, because they admitted that they were acting from self-interest or necessity rather than principle. Meanwhile, leaders who did exactly the same things but wrapped those actions in a narrative of duty, honor, necessity, or service to others, those leaders maintained their support and their positions. You see this pattern everywhere in modern life. The corporate executive who announces layoffs doesn't say, "We're doing this to increase profits and make shareholders happy." They say, "We're restructuring to ensure the long-term health of the company and protect the jobs of our remaining employees." The politician who starts a war doesn't say, "We're doing this for strategic resources and geopolitical advantage." They say, "We're defending freedom and protecting innocent lives." The person who betrays a confidence doesn't say, "I shared that information because it benefited me." They said, "I felt it was necessary to speak up because I was concerned about the broader situation." Same actions, different framing. And the framing is what determines whether they maintain support or lose it. Machiavelli isn't advocating for hypocrisy as a virtue in itself. He's observing that in the realm of power, perception shapes reality to such an extent that controlling perception becomes more important than the underlying reality. If you're going to operate in competitive environments, if you're going to make decisions that serve your interests, even when they might conflict with others' interests, you need to understand this principle. You need to master the art of framing your actions in terms that others find acceptable, of appearing to act for motives that people respect, regardless of what's actually driving your decisions. Because if you don't control the narrative around your actions, someone else will, and they will not frame them charitably. Lesson 5. Strike decisively when opportunity presents itself. Hesitation is fatal. Machiavelli observed that one of the most common ways that people lose power is not through making wrong decisions, but through making no decision at all, through hesitating when they should act, through waiting for perfect information or perfect conditions that never arrive, through being so paralyzed by the fear of making a mistake that they allow opportunities to slip away forever. He watched leaders lose kingdoms not because they were outmaneuvered by brilliant opponents, but because they failed to act when circumstances briefly favored them, when there was a window of opportunity that wouldn't remain open long. And by the time they finally worked up the courage to move, the circumstances had changed, the opportunity had closed, and they found themselves in a far worse position than if they had acted decisively when they had the chance. This principle cuts against our natural risk aversion. We're wired to fear loss more than we value equivalent gains. We're wired to prefer inaction over action when both carry risk, because action makes us feel responsible for negative outcomes in a way that inaction doesn't, even when inaction leads to the same or worse results. Machiavelli understood this psychological bias, and he understood that it's a fatal weakness in competitive environments. Because while you're hesitating, while you're gathering more information, while you're considering all possible consequences, your competitors are not standing still. They're moving, they're adapting, they're seizing opportunities. And the opportunity you're carefully analyzing, trying to determine if it's the perfect moment to act. That opportunity is evaporating with every moment you spend deliberating. The key insight here is about the relationship between timing and advantage. In any competitive situation, there are moments when the balance of power shifts, When someone is vulnerable or distracted, when circumstances align in a way that creates opportunity. These moments are almost always temporary. They exist because something is out of equilibrium, because some factor is changing, because there's a window between one stable state and another. And if you don't act during that window, the situation will stabilize into a new configuration that might be far less favorable to you. Machiavelli observed that successful political operators developed an instinct for these moments. They didn't wait for certainty. They didn't require perfect information. They recognized when conditions were as favorable as they were likely to get, and they moved decisively, accepting the risks that came with action because they understood that the risk of inaction was often greater. You can see this principle operating in your own life if you look for it. The job opportunity that requires a decision before you feel ready to make one. The relationship moment where you either speak up or forever change the dynamic by your silence. The business opportunity that won't wait for you to overcome all your doubts and fears. These are Machiavellian moments, points where hesitation is a choice with consequences just as real as action, where the illusion of safety in waiting is actually a guarantee of loss. And the people who consistently end up in positions of power and influence aren't necessarily smarter or more talented than everyone else. They're the ones who have developed the capacity to act decisively when opportunity presents itself, who have overcome the paralysis that comes from wanting certainty before commitment, who understand that perfect conditions never arrive and good enough conditions won't last. Lesson 6. Study your enemies more carefully than your friends. This might be Machiavelli's most practical piece of psychological advice. And it's something that most people get completely backward. We naturally focus our attention on the people we like, the people we're allied with, the people who support us. We spend our energy maintaining and deepening those relationships. Meanwhile, we avoid thinking about our enemies, our competitors, the people who oppose us. We tell ourselves they're not worth our time and energy. We dismiss them as irrelevant or incompetent. We avoid engaging with their perspectives because it's psychologically uncomfortable. And this is exactly the mistake that Machiavelli warns against, because your enemies are studying you. They're analyzing your weaknesses, your patterns, your blind spots. They're looking for opportunities to undermine or outmaneuver you. And if you're not studying them with equal intensity, you're voluntarily giving them an advantage. Machiavelli understood that your enemies are your most valuable source of information about your own vulnerabilities. They're motivated to find your weaknesses in a way your friends never will be. Your friends want to believe the best about you, want to see your strengths and overlook your flaws. Your enemies are looking for any crack in your armor, any inconsistency in your position, any vulnerability they can exploit. And if you pay attention, if you actually study what they're saying and doing, you can learn more about your own weak points from your enemies than you'll ever learn from your friends. They'll show you where you're exposed, where your strategy has gaps, where your assumptions are flawed. They're providing you with a free strategic audit, highlighting every vulnerability in your position. And most people are too proud or too uncomfortable to take advantage of this information. Beyond the defensive value of studying your enemies, there's also offensive value. When you deeply understand how your opponents think, what motivates them, what they fear, what they want, you can predict their moves. You can position yourself to benefit from their likely reactions. You can even manipulate situations to trigger responses from them that serve your interests. Machiavelli observed that the most successful political operators weren't the ones with the most resources or the strongest positions. They were the ones who understood their opponents so thoroughly that they could turn their opponents' own strategies and characteristics against them. They could predict resistance and prepare countermeasures. They could identify contradictions and exploit them. They could find the pressure points that would cause their enemies to make mistakes or overreact in your own life. Think about how much time and energy you spend understanding the people who oppose you, who compete with you, who might work against your interests. Most people spend almost no time on this. They avoid these people, dismiss them, try not to think about them. And then they're surprised when they get blindsided, when someone they dismissed as irrelevant or incompetent manages to undermine them, when an opponent they didn't take seriously enough outmaneuvers them. Machiavelli would tell you that this surprise is a choice. If you studied your enemies with even a fraction of the attention you give to your friends, you would see these moves coming. You would understand the motivations and strategies at play. You would be able to prepare, to counteract, to turn the situation to your advantage. Your enemies are giving you information constantly, through their words and actions, through what they focus on and what they ignore. But you have to be willing to pay attention, to set aside your ego and your comfort and actually engage with perspectives and strategies that oppose your own. Lesson 7. Never rely on the gratitude of others. This might be the most disillusioning of all Machiavelli's lessons, because it attacks one of our deepest assumptions about how relationships work. We want to believe that if we help people, if we're generous and supportive, if we come through for others when they need us, they'll remember that. They'll feel grateful. They'll return the favor when we need help. We build elaborate mental accounts of who owes us what, of the debts people have accumulated through our generosity, of the support we should be able to count on because of what we've given. And Machiavelli is telling us that this entire framework is dangerously naive. That gratitude is one of the weakest and most unreliable forces in human psychology. That people forget kindness with shocking speed. And that building your strategy around the expectation that others will remember and reciprocate your generosity is a recipe for betrayal and disappointment. Machiavelli observed this pattern constantly in political life. Leaders who had raised someone from nothing, who had given them opportunities and advantages they never could have achieved on their own, found themselves betrayed by those very people the moment circumstances changed. The protege who owed everything to their patron would turn against them without hesitation if it served their interests. The ally who had been saved from ruin would conveniently forget that debt when reminded of it became inconvenient. And this wasn't because these people were unusually evil or ungrateful. It was because gratitude is a psychologically uncomfortable emotion. It implies debt, implies inequality, implies that you're in a subordinate position to someone else. And humans have a powerful drive to eliminate that discomfort, to rewrite the narrative in a way that minimizes or eliminates the debt, to convince themselves that they actually earned whatever they received, or that the giver had ulterior motives, or that the situation has changed enough that old debts no longer apply. The practical implication of this insight is that you should never do something for someone based on the expectation that they'll return the favor later. If you're going to help someone, if you're going to be generous, do it because it serves your immediate interests, because it creates an obligation they'll need to honor right now while the memory is fresh, or because it aligns with your values regardless of whether you get anything back. But don't build strategies that depend on people remembering your past generosity and feeling motivated by gratitude to support you later. That motivation will fade far faster than you expect, and you'll find yourself in a position where you've spent resources helping others and have nothing to show for it, except the bitter realization that Machiavelli was right. This doesn't mean you should never help anyone or never be generous. It means you need to be strategic about it, understanding that generosity creates value primarily in the moment, not in some future return. If you help someone and they can immediately help you back, that's a reliable transaction. If you help someone and it builds a reputation that serves your interests, that's strategic. If you help someone because it aligns with your values and you do it regardless of any return, that's authentic. But if you help someone today expecting them to help you months or years from now out of gratitude, you're setting yourself up for disappointment. Machiavelli watched this play out over and over. Leaders who thought they had secured loyalty through past favors, discovering that gratitude has a half-life measured in weeks, not years. The people's memories of what you've done for them fade, while their awareness of what you haven't done for them lately remains vivid. Now, here's what's crucial to understand about all 7 of these lessons. Machiavelli isn't telling you to be cruel or evil. He's not advocating for betrayal or manipulation for their own sake. What he's doing is describing how power actually works, how human psychology actually functions in competitive environments. These principles are operating all around you right now, whether you acknowledge them or not. People are using them against you, consciously or unconsciously. And you have a choice. You can pretend these dynamics don't exist. You can cling to comfortable illusions about fairness and merit and good intentions. And you can be continually surprised and frustrated when things don't work out the way you think they should. Or you can face reality, can understand the game that's being played, can see the moves being made around you and make strategic decisions about how to respond. Machiavelli understood something that most people refuse to accept. The world doesn't care about your good intentions. It doesn't reward moral purity or authentic self-expression or naive faith in human goodness. It rewards strategic awareness, decisive action, and the ability to see situations clearly without the distortion of wishful thinking. His lessons aren't comfortable, but they're true. And the fact that they've remained relevant for 500 years, the fact that people are still reading The Prince and recognizing these patterns in their own lives, tells you something important. These aren't historical curiosities or outdated ideas. These are accurate descriptions of how human psychology works, how power operates, how competitive situations unfold. You don't have to like these lessons. You don't have to agree with them morally, but you do need to understand them, because understanding how power works is the first step to protecting yourself from people who will use these principles against you without hesitation or remorse. Machiavelli wasn't writing for tyrants and sociopaths. He was writing for anyone who wanted to understand political reality clearly enough to navigate it successfully. And that reality is just as relevant in your office, in your social circles, in your family dynamics as it was in Renaissance Florence. The specific contexts change, but the underlying psychology remains constant. And the people who understand that, who study these patterns and learn to recognize them in action, those are the people who end up in positions of influence and control, regardless of whether they're more talented or more deserving than anyone else. They're just playing the game at a different level, seeing moves that others don't recognize, understanding dynamics that others remain blind to. So take these lessons for what they are. Not a moral framework, not instructions for living a good life, but a clear-eyed description of how power works when you strip away all the comforting illusions. Use them to recognize when these dynamics are in play around you. Use them to understand why certain people succeed while others don't. Use them to make strategic decisions about when to compete and when to cooperate, when to reveal yourself and when to remain hidden, when to act and when to wait. Machiavelli gave you the map. What you do with it is up to you.